Hi guys, welcome back to the C# introductory course for .NET Framework and object-oriented programming. The last time I discussed some topics regarding setting up Visual Studio, creating a first solution and adding a project, and also explaining slightly about namespaces. And today the topic is variables. Now, a variable is a piece of information that you can store within a variable. So for example, if you want to store a number in a variable, that will be stored in the computer's memory. For example, if I have a variable of 1, then 1 is stored inside of the computer's memory. Now, there's also a lot of different data types. For example, a number is what we call in C# an int or an integer. So the data type is an int or an integer data type for a number. Now, in C# there are a lot of different data types. So if we look at this chart here, you can see we have a boolean, a byte, a short, int, long, float, double, decimal, char. And there are some C# specific data types out there as well. And this is what the value range is of, for example, a int or a integer number, basically. So you can see here, this is the minimum value that you can assign to a integer. And we'll talk about assigning variables in a minute. And this is the maximum for all these data types. Now, you have a difference between a primitive data type and a reference type. Now, these in this chart are all primitive types. And you also have non-primitive types, which are, for example, classes, arrays, enum, structs, etc. But we will go more into detail about primitive types and non-primitive types in a later topic. But there are a lot of different data types that have a different way of handling the way that they store information inside of the memory. But this will be discussed in a later topic. So we're going to keep it simple right now. We're going to create a variable name or a variable. And to do this in C#, you first have to specify the data type. Just discussed that we're going to add an integer number. As an example, so you use int for an integer. And you also have bool for a boolean, a char, etc. So you have all these different data types that you can choose from. Okay, so we're going to first specify the type of the variable. Say we want an int, and then we have to give a name for this variable that we want to store our number in. So we're going to say my int, for example, and we can say dot comma to end it. Okay, now you're wondering, okay, but what is the value of my int right now? Because I've just, I've set the type and the name, but what is the value? I have no idea. Well, in C#, there are, for different data types, there are default values. So a default value is a value that is given to the specific data type if it's not assigned yet. And how do we assign things? We do that by saying is 0, for example, then we're saying, okay, my int is storing the value of 0 right now. And this is what is called assignment. And if you do that the same way with saying the name and the type of the variable, this is called initializing a variable. So we can do it in one line, or we can say my int like this, and then my int is 0. This is exactly the same code as what was written before, only we're initializing it here and then we're assigning it. But you can also assign it when you first declare it or add it to your piece of code. Okay, now back to default values. So the default value of a integer is 0. Okay, for a boolean, for example, it's false. So if I do bool, so I'm declaring the boolean variable here, my bool. The default value of my bool is false. I will put a link in the description to show you a reference page of Microsoft where all the default values are shown for every type. Okay, so let's go back to our example, back to the integer, and assign it with 0. So assign it with 0, so my integer is 0. Right? Now we can give this variable that we've just created and gave a value to this read line, like we did before with the string value. Say my int, we pass the variable along, and the computer has now, well, the .NET framework, as it were, has stored this value inside of this variable, and we'll print it towards the screen with that value. Okay, so if we run the program now, you will see that the command prompt will show you the value 0. Now probably pop up on my other screen. There we go. See? It's got 0 now. Okay, let's close it and then the program will stop executing. Okay. The next thing to do is to introduce you to a, well, it's not a data type, but it's what is called a keyword in C#. Are you thinking, okay, what's a keyword? That is a universal, what can I say? A universal set of principles that is used throughout the whole C#.NET framework language. So, for example, if I type int again, you can see int keyword behind it. Basically means, this is just something out of the kernel, deep inside of the framework, that is always the same. In every framework version, we have to choose the version when we create our project. This is always the same principle. Okay, so I will introduce you to a keyword now, which is very C# specific, which is called var, V-A-R. Okay, what we can do with var, basically this keyword, it's not a type. You have to really take that in consideration. That's why I didn't want to say that it was a data type. it's a keyword. It basically means, okay, whatever I'm assigning it to, I will put that type into it. Okay, this might sound very confusing, but for example, I can create the new or the previous variable name, my bool, for the Boolean variable which we just done, and initialize it to false. Now, C#, the framework, will see now that this variable is a Boolean variable, because false is a Boolean property, so it will automatically link it to a Boolean. So that is the var keyword. For example, this myInt underneath here, we can change it, the type, to var. But remember very carefully, var is not a type. It is a keyword to make programming more easier, because you don't have to specifically write out which type you want to store it into. Makes sense. So you can just say var and then assign it to everything. But with var keyword, what you can't do, say var my decimal, for example, it will give you a red line, because it says, well, you need to initialize it. It's declared, it's not used, and you need to give it a type. I don't know what type to store in this variable, because you haven't given a type with the initialization, which we do with the other variables underneath here. See, we give it a system.boolean, a false is part of the boolean, and an int 0 is part of the 32-bit integer. So it will know it's an integer or a bool. So, and also, of course, a var does not have a default value. Okay. Now, what you can do as well is myInt, for example, now is 0, because I've initialized it and gave it the value 0. But I can override this, myInt, with a new number, for example 100. Now, if I run this, then the console will show 100 instead of 0, because I'm saying towards the memory of the computer, no, I don't want to store 0, I want to store 100 now. So if I run this, you'll see on the screen that it's 100. Now, let's do this with a reference type. So, reference type was a string or a class, this, or an array, for example, but I will tell you later about arrays. For now, let's keep it simple and do a string reference type. So a string is a reference type, also a keyword, and you can say, for example, my string is, do this, for example, these quotes. Remember when we put a value between the quotes and printed it towards the console? This basically means an empty string. So it's basically saying my string contains no text or any alphanumeric character in it. If we run this, you will also see that the console application will not show anything, right? Because we haven't stored anything in it yet. So let's change that by assigning my string to course. For 1 second, I don't think I just added my string towards the right line just now. So I'll show you, because then it makes sense that it didn't show anything. Again, as a proof, you can also test this on your own machine. So yeah, I've passed my string along now, and there's no value here. But it does start at the next line, see? So there's a white space here. Okay. So let's assign my string with value. Example course again. Now you will see if I run this, that course is shown and projected towards the console application. Now let's close this. And the big difference with reference and primitive data types is that we can assign null to it. And null, N-U-L-L, basically what that means is it is not initialized yet, even though we're initializing it here, but initializing it with null, which sounds very confusing, but basically it means this reference type has no value inside of it. It's totally empty, there's no initialization, there's no added assigned value to it. Even not an empty string. An empty string is different because it's still a string, but it's empty. And null is basically there's no initialization, there's no memory added or allocated with a value to it. The variable itself is stored in memory, but the value, there's no value. So if I pass this along, null, again, no value. Because it's not initialized yet. This also happens with classes, for example. But that will be discussed in a later topic. So the big difference between reference types and primitive data types for now in this part is that you can assign null to reference types, and primitive data types have a default value. Reference types do as well, but reference types default value is null. So that is basically what I want to discuss in this topic. So yeah, hopefully you've learned something. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below, and I will soon put a new video up regarding a different topic. Thank you.